Our topic is AI as a force for good. Sounds like Avengers. I'm conscious from the first panel this morning, the lesson was if you're going to talk about the ethics of AI, you have to be very specific about your values. So we have to figure out what good means. And we took a shot at that before the panel. There's so many things we could talk about. But let's define. Good could be better integrated logistics or call centers. That's good. But I think we're talking here about good for society in the sense of people having healthier, happier, more enriching lives. And that could go in many, many directions. Income inequality, diversity, environmental sustainability. We chose three, and the three topics we chose to talk about here are healthcare, so AI solutions for healthcare, itself a huge topic, obviously, education, and then caring for the aging population. So we're going to focus our comments in here. I'm conscious of having a lot of investors in the room. You will be interested in where's the opportunity and what does it look like. And I think we have a fascinating opportunity in thinking about what it looks like. Literally, what does it look like in terms of the form factors? So is it a disembodied voice? Is it a social robot that you can actually have a physical interaction with? So we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about barriers to commercialization. So if we've got these interesting opportunities, what might keep us from realizing AI for social good? So sound good?
Sounds great.
Yeah. So I thought we could start by just hearing from the panelists something that's exciting them that their teams are working on now. And I know Carla can't talk about that because she's got to be careful about what her teams are working on now. So if you can't do that, maybe something you launched recently?
Sure. I mean, I can speak generally, right? So I come from a user experience background, so my interest is in the human-computer interface and minimizing that and making that as frictionless and democratized as possible. I think, what's interesting about technologies like Google Assistant or these voice-enabled, disembodied, for now, assistants, is that they reduce that friction of interaction between human beings and machines in a way that creates accessibility for all kinds of people, right? So as we're speaking about healthcare and elderly population and education, I'll use my father-in-law as an example. For instance, he's an elderly gentleman. He has limited mobility. Is starting to get limited vision, and he's not really interested in learning how to use a smartphone, right? So there are already kind of these immediate cognitive and physical barriers to his use of the standard smartphone or laptop. But we know that because he has Google Homes in his home, that he can very easily access emergency services if anything happens. As these technologies evolve and machine perception becomes a real thing, and this is coming up very soon, right, where machines will not only have the ability to listen and decode language, will be able to visually scan environments for anomalies, understand if human beings in an environment are hurt or require assistance, things like that. Those are applications that I think are very exciting, and AI has the possibility to create kind of safer homes, safer schools, and accessibility for people who may have limitations with using standard technology. So that's maybe like a software answer to the question.
Does he have an emotional relationship with Google Assistant?
Not yet, but I think we're in the very nascent stages, yeah. I think, of this technology, right? And we also have to be very careful, I think, in the way that we approach that, and I'm sure you have a very strong and interesting point of view on that. But I'll also answer, sorry, that was a software component. There's also an interesting, I think, hardware component to some of the things that are happening out there right now. For example, Google just released a phone which has TensorFlow processing units native to the hardware, which means that AI and ML processing can be done on device. So the implications for that, I think, although this is not yet a reality, but the implications for next generations of that are that you can have total ML privacy really on a device. So for instance, if you are a student, you can have adaptive and differentiated learning. You can have a device that learns your learning patterns and generates content specifically for you, but you have the privacy implications of it never having to go up to the cloud and being shared, right? So for children, that could be something that might be very useful because their parents have total control because the AI processing is happening on device. Same thing for patient or medical data that could be confined specifically to a physical device and still have the full power and capabilities of AI and ML without being, sort of out there in the cloud with potential privacy concerns. So those are a couple of things.
Okay. Yeah, so I've actually been splitting my time today. There's a Science of Reading symposium going on, and the punchline is even in the United States, it turns out that only 40% of our seniors read proficiently. So if you think about the implications of that for our country, for our future, where you have to continue to read to learn new skills, to even have democracy, to be able to combat fake news, it's pretty dire. And it turns out that we just haven't made the gains that we think we should have given the advances in science. So the challenge is this achievement gap has already begun before you even enter the first day of school. And in fact, when you're in school, it turns out, as I've learned today, at best, the achievement gap remains. There's a lot of data showing it even gets worse once you're in school. So I just use this as an example because this is a theme of a lot of my research, which is you have to be able to intervene at home, not in the institution necessarily, at home. There's a lot of potential for the continuity of intervention, I'd say, between the institution and home, but you have to be able to engage people in the comfort of their home. Now, Dan Paulos made an interesting point yesterday, where she talked about the importance of engaging emotion when you want to have personal transformation. Now, she was talking about transformation on the stage, right? But when I think about technology, and I resonate with her about that point, because I agree, people cannot transform themselves, they can't change behavior, they can't learn something new, unless you really engage people at an emotional level. They have to care. So much of my research and my science and my technology has been about creating a new kind of technology that engages you, not just as a tool with data and charts, but really as an empathetic, supportive ally. And so when you're feeling the most vulnerable, whether you're struggling to learn something new, or you're a senior aging in place, or you're struggling with a chronic disease, this is common across all of these things. So a lot of my work has been looking at deeper personalized interventions at home, in the privacy of your home, where it's really about creating an AI that can work with you as a collaborative partner over a long period of time to make those transformative changes. To me, that is huge societal challenges across the globe require this kind of intervention. I think this is where a lot of the interesting science and innovation has yet to be done. And I think everything you were saying about pushing the machine learning into the edge, into the devices for privacy reasons, I think this is another really important aspect of that. But that's a lot of what my work is about. I work in early literacy. We deploy these systems into schools. We're deploying systems into assisted aging facilities. It turns out even in universities, I don't know if you've been following the news, mental health is a real issue among our top schools. There's many kids that are essentially so stressed out they can barely function. So we're really trying to look at these kinds of things: mental wellness, chronic disease management, aging with dignity and independence, and early childhood learning.
Mm-hmm. If we look a few years out, we have a bunch of general purpose software platforms that could be adapted for if we can call these vertical applications, healthcare, education, so forth. So Siri and Alexa and Google Assistant and Cortana and Watson, et cetera, et cetera. So that could be one direction this world heads in, which is we've got these platforms which have required tremendous investment and a great deal of invention and has gone into them, and they can be adapted for use in those specific applications. Or you could have folks develop solutions specifically for education, specifically for healthcare. Is it too early to say what that world might look like? What do you think?
Well, I think in a lot of the areas that I've been exploring, you actually need a lot of deep expertise and insights in order to create something that actually works for people and for a diversity of people. So it's not just a certain kind of person, right? I mean, there's different learning abilities, different ages, different social economic classes, different cultural differences. There's still just, I think, a lot of expertise that has to be brought to bear to come up with solutions that really, really work. I think we're certainly, even in my own research lab, starting to leverage the affordability and the accessibility of these cognitive services more and more, which is great, face recognition, speaker ID, ASR, all of those things. But we're still having to do a lot of fundamental research, I would say, in the development of the algorithms that actually build the relationship and understand the emotional cognitive states in context and build those personalized models. So that's really, I think, still where the computational science of the research is. But certainly having access to these, more affordable, high-performing, computational devices and sensors and all, they're certainly accelerating our ability to do that. And it's certainly enabling us to now deploy these systems, even in a research context, but deploy these systems in the real world in order to really iterate and understand their efficacy. So it's certainly helping to advance the science as well.
I can say, so not speaking for Google, but I can certainly see a world where Google or a company might create an open platform which has links into hardware and sensors and systems that can be trained for specific purposes, and then opening those platforms up to different companies who have domain expertise in education or healthcare, et cetera, that might be developing special purpose platforms that use kind of these kind of almost out of the box models and the hardware ecosystems that they might come with, configure them in specific ways that make them appropriate for a kindergarten classroom versus a healthcare clinic, and then have these kind of out of the box MLs that can be trained with data that's specific to solve that particular problem for that context.
Got it. Yeah. So platform with essentially third-party applications that provide the superior solutions. Robots versus disembodied voices versus screens.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what Jibo was a robot?
Sure, yeah. So I can tell you, this has been a topic that's in academia has been studied for over a decade. So I'd say there's probably more than 90 randomized controlled trials, like rigorous randomized controlled trials across many different tasks, asking the question, how do these different kinds of embodiments and experiences compare? So a physically co-present social robot versus a screen with an avatar versus even a video of a robot that must be real, but it's in another room, to a disembodied voice coming out of the speaker, and like everything in between. And we've actually been running a set of studies in our own lab comparing these. And here's the punchline is, we are such a profoundly social and emotional species. The social and emotional qualities affect everything that we do, from how we learn, how we think, our beliefs, our behaviors, everything. And so when a technology supports more of these human attributes, more of these human ways of experiencing and knowing the world around us, the more we engage, the more deeply we engage, and often the more successful we are. So we've done this interesting, we call it robot speed dating, where we invite people in off the street who have not necessarily, they don't own any of these devices, kind of their first encounter, and we have a social robot that can turn and look at you and has those expressive abilities. We even did a comparison between the Alexa speaker and the Google Home. So both talking speakers, but you can argue the Alexa at least is a name. It has kind of an orienting light. And Google, I would say, they tried to actually not add these qualities. So it's okay Google, it's flickering lights, okay. So the punchline is we will bring people in, we allow them to, we have a list of things you can ask the robots across these different categories. We just let them have at it. And what we find is there's obviously, I would be saying this if it wasn't true, but there is an attraction obviously to the social robot. But even when you talk about things, and especially on the emotional dimension, the strongest of the robot, but even when you look at interesting categories like information, right? You would think Google would score the highest information. When you look at this spectrum of social emotional engagement, there's actually not a strong preference people will cite. Alexa, Jibo, Google, they're all kind of the same. So then we repeated the experiment. We said, let's say it's a branded introduction. So as opposed to these are kind of these spectrum of interpersonal qualities, this is Jibo. It's a company that sells social robots. This is Amazon. So now you say, okay, Amazon, or hey, Amazon. And then you say, okay, it starts to disappear. So now when you look at something like information, now Google shoots to the top. So it's just to say that these social and emotional qualities are actually really profound. And I think as we design these experiences for people, the more we appreciate just how our human minds and behaviors work, we're going to be able to design things that are just way more engaging and effective for people.
I think the fence that we have to navigate around is trust, is user trust, right? The social and emotional qualities can engender a deep degree of trust. But then on the other side of it, again, because I'm coming from the world of Google, right, and we have all kinds of privacy. There's so much information that we have access to. There's really so much potential for, really nefarious applications in the world that we navigate, that we approach the edge of the uncanny valley very quickly, right? So we have to be quite cautious with how human we project our work to be.
Everybody understand uncanny valley? I think so, but could you do it, a definition?
Sure. Just there's a valley between which people. So there's a kind of a curve, I guess, where people the level to which you trust a humanoid interaction suddenly drops when the interaction becomes too human, when it becomes sort of creepily human. I suppose. That's
I mean, it's actually more around emotional engagement, but there is this intuition of this valley where if it's not that human, people kind of can deal with it.
That's right.
But if it gets to be too human-like but doesn't really nail it, it can actually have the adverse effect on you. It can actually creep you out.
That's right.
So that's essentially the conjecture of the uncanny valley, yeah.
So when we begin to approach the uncanny valley, again, because I think the depth of potential nefariousness, right? The depth of damage that could be possibly perceived by this kind of hyper-intelligent entity that might have access to quite a lot of information about your life. The emotional toll on that and the psychological toll on trust is quite deep. So I think our approach has tended to be to try and calibrate the humanness of the interaction depending on the context.
So are you actually making the assistant less
I would say,
clever and surprising and distracted and human?
I would say we isolate it for particular contexts. Mm-hmm. So for instance, there are contexts where you can ask the assistant to tell me a joke or tell me a story. In those circumstances, we allow the injection of more humor, more kind of natural organic language, more colloquialisms. Mm-hmm. If you're asking the assistant to just tell you what's on your calendar so that you can get to work on time, then it's a little bit more straightforward and
wow.
So we try to calibrate for the context so that the level of psychological trust is maintained at a comfortable.
Thank you. Commercialization. So for each of you, if you think of an inventor or an entrepreneur with a great idea that can apply AI for social good, mm-hmm. What's the biggest barrier to moving it from idea to reality that has big impact?
So I'm going to build a little bit on what you had said, but take this in a little more future-looking direction. So I think when we talk about how can we help people understand these technologies and how they work, I think that's actually really important, right? Because we do have now young children talking to Alexa, to our oldest citizens. There's a lot of hype on AI. People don't understand what AI is, and yet we're living in this time where it's pervading and going into everything. So another area that I've been really passionate about and leading across all of MIT is to say, what is AI literacy for society? And how can we educate and empower from children onward to not only understand these technologies, but to empower them to actually create things with these technologies? Because, as we talked about earlier, these platforms, these cognitive services are becoming so accessible. We're actually putting them into kids programming packages like Scratch and App Inventor. So we literally have 8-year-olds training machine learning models and putting it into their own game. So this is the future where it's kind of like, there was a time when only computer scientists could make a website. Now many people can. We're getting to the point, I think, where the people who can create AI-based solutions are not just going to be people with deep expertise in AI. It's going to be a lot of people. So when we talk about trust, when we talk about how to encourage the next generation of AI innovators, my goal is to make sure that it is the most diverse, inclusive group of people we can imagine. Because right now, when people ask me what my biggest fear about AI is, I say as long as it's a technology designed by the elite, controlled by the elite, we risk a future where it's going to exacerbate the prosperity divide and not close it. Mm-hmm. And the only way you combat that is through access and education. And so I think that is my passion of how to help cultivate the next, not just one or two, but next generation of AI innovators.
Yeah.
From my perspective, I guess it's opening the box so that AI is trainable for end users, right? Ultimately, I think the way we still develop AI systems is that the data is being gathered by and curated by and trained by, like you said, sort of an elite or selected group of people, whether it's engineers within a company or people who are using an off-the-shelf ML system and training it with their own data. But there's still not very many AI systems that are out there that are amassed that enable the end user to actually train the model for their purposes. So that we heard earlier about bias that we see in data when you do a search for female CEOs. You tend to see mostly men. If I did that image search on Google, could I go back and make a modification and say that I believe that there's a bias in this data? I would like to train this model myself. I think there's an opportunity there, and it would go very far towards AI literacy. Is Absolutely. If we, as creators of this technology, were able to open up, these kind of training mechanisms or training affordances, so that anybody using an AI-enabled system has the opportunity to actually shape the model.
Yeah, and I would say, to build on that as well, the way we're approaching this, it's a very hands-on constructionist-based curriculum we're developing, but we're baking the ethics into it from the very beginning. So we take the position of children are the ethical, empathetic designers of the future. We want to cultivate all of those qualities so they understand, as they're learning about supervised machine learning and data sets, how bias can happen and what their role as a designer and the decisions they make affect not only the technical performance of these systems, but potentially the social impact in terms of who it's impacting as well. So I think that's got to be a new approach of how we educate and train people of all levels, I think, about these technologies, because they can have such huge impact now very easily that we really just have to be, we can't rely on, I think, other people to be the ethicist and look at. The more that we are aware of these methods and these frameworks and these ways of designing, the better off we'll all be.
If we're closing in on the point where the end user has access to, or entrepreneurs who aren't data scientists will have access to tools to create applications, does that mean we're hitting diminishing returns on the science? Is the technology where it needs to be? So a couple of the applications we spoke about, mental health, diagnosing and treating, literacy, sort of helping people learn how to read. Are we anywhere near the point where the AI system can do those things and now it's just a matter of rolling it out, or is there a lot more science to do?
I think there's certainly a lot more science to do. There's a lot more computational science to do. So, we've had this heyday around deep learning, right? So deep learning is a supervised machine learning technique. It requires lots and lots of data. Now within academia, we're very interested in, well, so how do you learn from sparse data? And how do you leverage the small data sets that you have to do transfer learning to accelerate more robust solutions that require basically either the machine to learn from its own experience or just smaller sets of data. So there's plenty of interesting computational research problems that can have huge implications for the future. Right now, generative adversarial networks are getting to be kind of this really popular methodology, which is around generative AI. And now there's conferences and things sprouting up about those topics. So there will always, I think, be, the kinds of methods that are proven enough that you can go out into the real world and you can create, innovate and disrupt around those methodologies. There's certainly many, many, many other hard problems to solve in AI that's going to continue to propel that forward. We talk about the importance of just common sense, right? Machines do not have common sense yet, and that would be another huge enabler. So many, many, many interesting problems left to be done. But I think, we're very much in the age of the deep and narrow systems. I think we're gonna keep getting a lot of value out of that, in well into the future. But I think as we can start to move beyond the deep and narrow to the more general and flexible, the more people we're going to be able to help, the more benefit we're going to be achieved, because they'll just be more versatile over time. So again, lots of work to still be done, lots of opportunity.
Intuition about whether the breakthroughs and the big impact will come from tech giants, Facebook, Google, et cetera, versus startups, versus not-for-profits in the mold of Khan Academy or Wikipedia. We see a lot of different models for innovation and having impact. Where might it come from?
Well, don't forget academia.
Yeah.
We do a lot of breakthrough stuff in academia.
Yeah.
But
I think I gave an answer to this similar before, which is I think the most plausible direction will be that companies with a lot of resources might create platforms that can then be open sourced and then trained towards specific purposes and adapted by new companies who might evolve on those training algorithms, might feed them with new data, might develop new hardware that's compatible with those models for different sensory purposes, right? So as the world of as machines, so to speak, gain more and more senses, right? So they can not only process language, but very soon they'll be able to sort of see things, observe an environment, understand anomalies, recognize spatial features. As those things kind of multiply, I think additional companies will come on board and start to optimize for those capabilities and for specific contexts. But I see a platform model being the most plausible way to move forward, and it would certainly be the most. I think it would be ideal in that it would enable for more rapid expansion because of standardization.
If you each think back to when you were first exposed to AI, learned about it, and your view of its potential then, and compare that to where you're at now in terms of thinking what it can do and what it should do and shouldn't do, what big changes compared to where you've been and where you're going?
Yeah, so I was a Star Wars girl. I was first inspired by R2-D2 and C-3PO when I was like 10. So, I can look back on my life and talk about the story of how, I started to create social robots and do what I do. But, the punchline, I think, is for so many of us who end up going to the field of AI, we are since childhood inspired by science fiction, and it can really create a kind of almost what we prize and value about those systems and the future we aspire to create with those technologies. So for me, it was around creating machines that weren't just useful but could actually engage and support us in a much more humanistic sense, right? And that's really been what my life's work has been around. Now, we still got a lot of work to do before we're going to get to those kinds of droids like R2-D2 and C-3PO. But we're starting to see these systems being deployed in real-world environments with real people and really helping people in meaningful ways and creating an emotional connection with people that is quite profound. And I think, my position around the emotional engagement has been evolving over time, which for me right now, I've come to appreciate that you need to create experiences, again, that deeply engage the human experience and human emotions to really enable that transformative change, right? And that's really the crux of a lot of these technologies that I create. It's around the importance of recognizing emotion and empowering us to be who we aspire to be. And we're still in this time where it's biased by data and charts and information. It's like that actually doesn't motivate most people, it turns out, right? I mean, a lot of these problems are hard because we do a lot of the perception, the modeling, but we're not really great at the engagement. And I think this is where kind of the next big frontier is going to happen, especially when we're talking about, again, these huge societal challenges around aging and healthcare and behavior change and education. These are huge levers of creating a society that will be a much more vibrant, flourishing society if we can really figure out solutions that can aspire and empower people to engage in that process of self-transformation.
I would say, interestingly, my answer is going to be fairly different. I think initially when I went into this, I expected that, in a few years we would have a world where I have this virtual assistant, whether embodied or not, who knows everything about me, knows my entire life, knows all of the patterns of behavior, knows all my needs, can anticipate what I want before I even open my eyes in the morning and have my coffee ready and my car ready to go, et cetera, right? But I think the reality is that at least in the shorter term, in the next few years, what's in terms of commercial viability and what sort of society is ready for, before, is we're probably going to be moving into a world of more specialized assistants, right? Like I might have my financial health assistant who helps me kind of optimize my finances. I might have my workout and diet assistant who knows those patterns, but those assistants may or may not be sharing data about me across each other, and I maybe activate them in particular contexts. And those contexts could be around goals, like what I just mentioned, like financial fitness, et cetera. They could be around physical contexts, like my kitchen assistant doesn't need to talk to my car assistant, for example, right? And I think, really a large part of that is privacy concerns, right? Is data isolation. So this need to have a very intelligent assistant that can assist me in this particular context or need, but doesn't know everything else about my life because it doesn't need to perform that one task. So I think that's a world that I feel like we'll be moving into in more of the shorter term, and not these kind of all-knowing AIs that at least I expected, a few years ago.
I think this actually raises a really important point, which is, what is the appropriate role of AI in our lives? And my dystopia is a world where AI does everything for us, because we as human beings, to be able to flourish, have to be engaged in our lives, right? We need to find meaning. We need to belong to things that are bigger than just us. We need to have achievement. We need all of these things. And I would want an AI that helps to promote flourishing, not just automatizing everything for the sake of it being able to do that. So it gets down to the ethics, but also like, what kind of future society do we want to be in? And I want to see a society where everyone is as empowered as they can be to live the life they want to live and to flourish with these intelligent machines. And I think this is one of the most fascinating areas as we move into the future, which is, what is the human-AI relationship? And not just the working relationship, but the living relationship. Because I think only till very recently have we started to truly live with AI. It used to be kind of like just on my phone or whatever, I'd be at work. But now, because it can be in a device that's kind of AI on top that I can just speak to it, it's transforming potentially its role in terms of pervading many different aspects of our lives, as well as who. Again, from young children to our oldest citizens. And so I think the ethics and really thinking about the nature of that human-AI relationship and what that means to shaping us as a society and as individuals is really, really important right now.